So, my name is Wendy Roberts. I have been working as a practice mentor on the Effective Child Protection Project in Gwynedd. The project was initially funded for 2 years by the North Wales Regional Transformation Board for us to be able to look really at improving practice with children and families, trying to make that work more effective and trying to see what we can do as practitioners to develop our skills in that area and to work more collaboratively with children and families. So the project does have four main elements, which are conversations, threshold, change and measure, and they come together to form the model. But underlying that, what we found through doing the project was that there was an underlying principle of reflective practice, which we were keen to explore further.
My name's Siobhan McLean. I'm a registered social worker, but most of my work now revolves around training social workers and students and writing about practice. And generally, the areas that I'm very interested in are reflective practice and theory and practice. And so I've been doing some work alongside of Wendy, co-working across the project to look at embedding reflective practice more in supervision and in day-to-day practice. I think what is reflective practice is actually, it's a much more complicated question than it seems on the face of it, isn't it? Because it's so layered. It's so reflection and reflective practice. There are so many layers to it, really. On a very basic level, it's just about thinking, thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it and after you've done it. It's just about constantly thinking about your practice and the work that you're doing. But then on a deeper level, it's about taking into account values, issues and bias that you might have in your work and thinking about what you've learned from it and thinking about change and how to bring about change. And it's thinking about, on an even deeper level, it's really starting to bring about self-awareness. So you start to think about yourself and the impact that you've had on the situation, the impact the situation has had on you. Why do you see it in this way and another person sees it in another way? It's all of that. So it's so layered in terms of what it is. And I wonder if sometimes it's almost presented as something that's actually quite simple, and it isn't simple. It is quite a layered, complex thing. So I suppose that's my thoughts. What about you, Wendy?
Yeah, I think, like you've said, thinking about it in the layers and the depth is really important, because I think reflection can take place at different levels. I think what we need to get to is a point where people are going that bit deeper, going into themselves and working out, kind of unpicking all the different things, like you said, to do with power or anything that might play a part, really. Because I think people can do a lot of surface level reflection, but you need to find that kind of way to go deeper and work out kind of what effect it's having on your practice, why you're doing things. And I think as well, it's about taking that pause and thinking about, okay, what am I going to do differently? Or what can I learn from this? Because it doesn't have to be about just what's gone wrong or what you would do differently. It can be about actually what went well, and what you're taking from that, so that you are using the good things in your day-to-day practice, and you may be changing some of your practice in terms of what hasn't gone so well.
Actually, I think that's really important. And I think if there was one thing that I could change about reflective practice and the way we talk about it and the way it's explored in training and in supervision, is that it does have often a focus on what didn't go well. What should we do differently? And so that can mean it creates a bit of a crisis of confidence for people, and people sometimes become overly self-critical, and quite often people are very in touch with what they need to improve or change, but they're not as in touch with what they do really well and what's been going really well. And I think I suppose especially at the moment when practice is actually so challenging for people and we're in such difficult times, that actually kindness in reflection is really important. So being self-kind, thinking about, well, what did go well there, and what did I do well, and what can I carry on doing in that way, I think is as important as looking at what didn't go well, because we need to also build on our strengths. I mean, after all, social work is about strengths-based practice, but that doesn't yet seem to have filtered through into thinking about reflection. Reflection should also be about what's going well, shouldn't it? And self-kindness, I think, is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that fits in really nicely with what we were trying to do with the project. One of our mottos that we would say often in our training sessions, or when we were talking with workers, would be kind to yourselves. You know, you're doing something new, and it's the same kind of principle with reflection, isn't it? You know, when you're learning new things or you're learning from an experience, you know, it's about being kind with that. You know, we are there to develop and learn and hopefully become practitioners because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the other aspect really around reflection that we've not really talked about is the stages of reflection. So, and I think sometimes Shern talks about this, didn't he? He talks about reflection in action and on action. So reflection in action being what you do in the moment as you're thinking about it, you know, thinking in the moment as something's happening. And then reflection on action is what we do later when we're looking back. So thinking about, reflecting on what's happened. But one stage of reflection that Shern didn't talk about, and I've only really learnt about in the last few years really, is reflection for action. And that's about thinking ahead, reflecting before we do something. And that reflection for action, really interestingly, comes from engineering. And I've only kind of really learned about this recently, but it comes from engineering, where their view is, you know, we don't build a bridge and then it falls down and then we reflect afterwards on why did it fall down. We actually reflect before, and that's the most important stage of reflection. So we do a lot of the problem solving before the action, and that's the reflecting before. And I think that's such an important stage, but we don't talk about that very much in our social work training. And I think we'd benefit more from, and I don't know about you, but I think perhaps sometimes the more experienced you become as a social worker, the more often we just respond in the moment and run off and do something and just get it done. I think we tend to be, as social workers, really focused on practical skills. You know, people talk about, oh, you did that really well, but nobody ever says, oh, you thought about that really well. So the focus is always on what we do, not what we think. So I wonder if sometimes we jump in and we could spend a bit more time thinking ahead and planning ahead. And that reflection for action, for me, is perhaps one of the most important stages of reflection, I think.
That's really made me consider in terms of supervision and how we use supervision for reflecting on the work that we've done with people, but how many social workers actually use it to take a step back and think, actually, I want to use this reflection time to plan for my visit with a family. I think social workers can be very good at planning things and thinking about what they need to do, but maybe they don't unpick that and reflect on it and think, why am I doing this with this family, and what do I want to achieve from that session? So maybe spending that time reflecting for action would be really useful.
Yeah. And actually, that gives me a connection that I've not thought about before in terms of supervision, because there's some research on supervision that David Wilkins and his team did. And that talks about how a worker should come out of supervision in relation to each family they're working with. They should be able to look at and think about, what am I going to do in the next couple of visits with this family? Why am I doing that? And how am I going to do it? And I think that what, why, and how as a really basic reflective framework could be helpful to reflect for action, you know, as adding into the planning ahead. But planning is more of a kind of description of what I'm going to do, isn't it? Whereas the reflection for action is thinking through the different possibilities. So I think that's made a really good connection there. I think this is a really interesting question, actually, and it links to the what is reflection. You know, what and why always link together, don't they? But when I was working on the booklet for the project about reflective practice, one of the things that I really became aware of in trying to put that booklet together was when I was explaining what is reflective practice, it struck me that actually what is reflective practice is the same as what is good social work. So you almost can't separate the two, really, because reflective practice and good quality practice in social work are one and the same thing. So that's, I suppose, the basis of why it's important is if you want to be a good social worker, you need to do it reflectively. And I suppose that children and their families have a right to expect that any professional involved in their life is going to take that responsibility very seriously, and they're going to think about what they're doing, and they're going to draw on research and knowledge and understanding and think about theory and use all of that as part of their practice, because, you know, people have a right to expect that the decisions that we're making are based on thorough thought, if you like. So I suppose that's, for me, one of the main reasons it's important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you with that. And I think it links in with our development as social workers, doesn't it? Because we're taught right from the very beginning when we go to university and we learn about what social work is and how to be a social work practitioner. We're taught that reflection links to things like emotional intelligence, empathy, resilience, self-awareness. But unless you actually take a step back and think about why you've done something in a certain way, what it actually means to you, what that might have meant to the family or the individual that you're working with, I don't think you can develop as a social worker. So I think you need to be able to take that step back and really understand yourself and the effect that that can have. And I think only through reflection can you do that, because you need to pause, you need to think about it, and you need to understand why the things you do and what and how that all impacts on the interventions that we have with families, really.
Interesting that you used the what, why, how framework loads there, didn't you, as you were talking, because it is a really good reflective framework and basic reflective framework. I also think that, as well as you know, you've said there, it's a key part of our development, and it is, and it's a key part of our training and learning. I also think it's a key aspect of self-care, really, and looking after ourselves, because, you know, especially thinking about how we're working at the moment in the middle of a global pandemic. You know, here we are both sitting at home, you know, talking to each other on camera. But, you know, if you're a busy social worker and you might take one of those really difficult telephone calls, and if you sat at home, then that's really hard to deal with. If you're in the office, you take one of those difficult phone calls, you know, perhaps where somebody will say, oh, I'm going to hold you responsible for this, or those kinds of things. And there's someone in the office who'll hear that, isn't there? And they'll come over and say, oh, that sounded tough. Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want to talk about it? When you're on your own, that's not there. You don't have that support in place. You're just on your own, taking these really difficult telephone calls, listening to trauma, dealing with really difficult issues, sitting in your bedroom or at your kitchen table. And actually, you really need to be thinking that through and reflecting on it and taking good care of yourself. I know that you and I have talked quite a bit about moral injury as a concept, which is really just about that, I suppose, element of where the psychological distress that the work that we do can create for us. And I've been very worried about a sort of increased experience of moral injury in staff who are working at home and working in isolation. But what we know, all of the research around moral injury tells us that the one thing that can prevent moral injury or can mitigate how significant it is reflection and reflective supervision. So I think it's, you know, there's research there that tells us how important reflection is for looking after ourselves.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think we learned quite early on in the project, really, about reflection and reflective practice and how that would support workers on the front line. the project focus was obviously on the specific model to work with in child protection, and across the kind of children and families field. But I think we realised that kind of reflection was kind of underpinning everything, that we needed to provide space and thinking time for workers. And we kind of thought about how we could bring that in to kind of my role in the project to make sure that that was happening. Because when you're really stressed and you've got a lot on with work, it can be really hard to prioritise that reflective space and reflective time. And we talk a lot about prioritising in social work, I think. But for some reason, as social workers, it can be quite hard to actually do it because we think there's always something that's more important that we need to be doing.
Absolutely. I think that takes us on to the next question as well, doesn't it?
So I think that's a good question, because I think there is this kind of misunderstanding at times from social workers that it's actually something that is naturally within us and that it comes really naturally to be a reflective practitioner. So I think for some people, it will come naturally. Some people will be naturally reflective, but for others, it is something, a skill that needs to be practiced and developed, and you need to find what works for you. And I think reflection comes in so many different forms that we can get into a habit of thinking, oh, this is reflective practice and I do it because I use this model. Whereas actually it can be so many different things. It can be about what you're writing, a reflective journal, a reflective discussion. It can be about having that critical friend. So I think it's just such a bigger thing than some people think about. And it's about having that space to practice, really.
Yeah. I suppose what I've taken from that and what you've said there is maybe actually for some people it might be easy, but for other people it's not. And most of the people I've met in my career, it's not an easy thing to do. But I suppose that takes us back to the beginning where we talked about this is quite a complex and layered thing, being reflective. So of course it's not easy when it's complex and layered. Maybe if you want to do it on a surface level, it's easy, but actually the deeper you want to take it, the more difficult and more challenging that can become. And I think it's interesting as well that you talked there about models. And I wonder whether sometimes, as you say, there are so many different models of reflection out there, but actually in our training, we tend to just be taught a couple of models of reflection. And sometimes I think whether this is actually said at university or whether it's just what students hear, but a lot of students will say to me, but we were told that is reflection, rather than that's a model of reflection. That's one way of reflecting. People are told here, this is the way to reflect. And if that model doesn't work for them, then they think, oh, I'm not a reflective practitioner, or I struggle to be reflective or something. But actually, as you've said, I think we've all got to work at it. And we've all got to find a model that works for us. And sometimes it can be a very simple model, like what, why, how. And sometimes you want to use a much more complex model to look at something. And different models work for different things. If you want to reflect on just a single incident, then there's some really good models. If you want to reflect on over a longer period of time, maybe, the last 3 months that I've been working with this family, then you're going to want to use a different model. So I think it's not easy because it's complex, but I think there are things that you can do to make it easier for yourself. As you say, really, it's about practicing it, keeping on doing it, really, isn't it? It's and it's also about being open to new ideas and new models. And there might be a model that's worked for you for years, but then maybe you need to freshen it up a bit, because is it still reflection if you're just doing the same model all the time? If you're just structuring your thought process in the same way, in a way, it's almost become a bit process or proceduralized. And so maybe mixing it up a bit. So it's not easy. It needs to be kept fresh. It needs to be worked on, but also it's worth that work. It's worth that effort. It's really worth putting the work in to become more reflective, I think.
Definitely. And I think over the course of the project, I felt myself kind of growing in terms of my confidence in relation to reflective practice and understanding reflection in a different way. And I liked what you were saying in terms of trying the different things out, because I think sometimes you can maybe try a model out and you don't quite get it or you don't quite gel with it, but then you might approach it on a different day and get something completely different from it. So I think it's really interesting to be able to play about with it a bit and just develop that confidence really as well as the skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And playing about with it, that's a lovely way of putting it, because, you know, within the project, when we brought the social workers together to create their own models, and really it does feel a bit like you're playing with something when you're making your own model and you're developing it, but you could almost see the growth in confidence when people talked about their own models. And I've seen that a lot in my own practice, that people often are more confident about talking reflectively when they've developed their own model, because they almost understand, well, what they're thinking about. And I think it can be quite empowering in a way to do that, to create your own model.
Definitely. So the barriers, I think across the course of the project, we learned definitely that one of the major barriers for social workers, and I suppose in my own experience of being a social worker as well, is just having that time to reflect, making that time, making it a priority, like we said before. And I think as well, it's not just about individual responsibility. I think there needs to be a way that the organisation is saying, we are offering you this, or it is okay to take that time, because I think we can feel that everything else is always a priority. And how do we make sure that we're taking that step back really and allowing ourselves that time to think things through?
Yeah, I mean, time is always a huge one. You know, when I'm training and I ask people, what are your own barriers? They'll always talk about time. And for me as a trainer, it's quite challenging, that, because I can't create time for people. So it's really good to hear, you know, the project is really looking at taking that organizational responsibility of helping to give time, because in a way, I think you could look at the barriers as there are individual barriers that, you know, maybe we have within us, but there are also organizational barriers, like not having enough time. But some of the other organizational barriers, I think, can include things like a lack of reflective supervision. If you don't have that space for reflection within supervision, if supervision is all about, you know, have you done this? Have you closed that? Have you done? It becomes very much about what you've done rather than what you're thinking. And it's almost, in a way, separates out the thinking and the doing, and you can't separate those two. But I think that's another barrier, is that lack of good quality reflective supervision. And I know that's something that the project has been working on, and actually is still working on now, isn't it? That supervision being really important. I think some of the other barriers we've actually already talked about. Well, we've already talked a lot about the time one, because I think you've used the word pause 3 or 4 times when you've been talking, and it made me think about, we don't always have time to pause, or we don't always feel like we've got time to pause. So we've talked about a lot of the barriers, but things like models, you know, some of the models actually can create barriers to reflection, because they become very much just about a focus being on reflection, is looking back and looking at what didn't work well, and that creates a crisis of confidence. So I think, not, you know, if we can open that up a little bit more and have more models, and models that are kinder to practitioners, and models that are developed by practitioners, all of that, that can overcome some of those barriers that I think are sometimes created in training, actually, and in the way in which reflection is presented, because it's often presented as looking back, writing about what you did and what you would do differently. And that's because, you know, it's how an assignment is marked, and you have to write about something you've done. But that's not, you know, it's not all of reflection, is it? But I think there's lots of barriers that are created all the way along our journeys, so that as qualified practitioners, sometimes you've got to go back to that initial training, barriers that were created there. You've got to look at creating time for people. You've got to look at giving them the confidence, I think, to be more reflective. I think sometimes it creates a crisis of confidence, and people can feel Because very often reflection just gives you loads of questions, doesn't give you many answers sometimes, and then that leads you to feeling much more uncertain about your practice. So I think there can be lots of different barriers, but as you know, when you were talking about the organisation recognising what they needed to do, I think we need to look at barriers that are individual but also organisational.
Yeah, you made me think then about those individual barriers and what you said earlier about being open to learning and trying new things, because I think we can box things off, and I think we can get quite stuck with something and think, oh, that works, so I'll just carry on doing it. So having that openness and willingness to try different things, even when it makes us feel quite uncomfortable at times, is a really kind of fresh way to look at it and really positive way to look at it as a social worker. And I'd like to think that one of the barriers can be ourselves, in that we think that things have to be done in a certain way. But I think the more we do try things, the more we use them in our day-to-day work and in our teams, then hopefully we'll get that level of confidence where you get to that point of like that unconscious competence. So you're just doing it naturally. And I think it would be lovely to think that we get to that stage as practitioners, really.
Yeah, that's just made me think actually about, I think a lot of people have been talking about, you know, the way that work has changed since the pandemic, and we're working much more from home now. And I think that this is going to have, you know, long-term consequences for the way we practice as social workers. But I think a lot of people have talked to me about seeing that as barriers to reflection. Because we're not together sitting in the office chatting to one another, which is where a lot of the reflection would have taken place in the past. But actually, I see this as a real opportunity for us to think about that unique sort of individual responsibility for reflection, really, and how we can do it differently. And as you know, what I think has been really interesting about working with you on the project, Wendy, is that you have been really open to new ideas, and I think also you've encouraged social workers as part of the project to be open to new ideas. You know, a lot of people, if you said to them, okay, let's build our own model of reflection, or let's, you know, some of the things that I've been doing, I think can be quite challenging to people. When I say find an object, or, you know, talk about the weather in relation to your reflection, sometimes people kind of look at you a bit, well, that's not an academic way of reflecting. But actually, it means that you become, I think, that bit more creative, seeing things differently. You know, I hate the phrase, but it's like thinking outside the box stuff, isn't it? It's about that creativity and reflection that I think go hand in hand together, really. So I think, yes, one of the individual barriers can be if people are not open to doing that. And I think because of those new ways of working, we've got to be more open to new ways of reflection, almost, I think. So I suppose some of the key things that are needed to support reflection actually are about how do we address the barriers in lots of ways, aren't they? So all of these things become connected as we're talking it through. I think definitely reflective supervision is really important. And, you know, I mean, I do a lot of work on reflective supervision, but one of the things that really has struck me and is maybe something we need to think about as a profession is that we know that the most significant influencer on how we provide supervision is the supervision that we ourselves receive. And I think a lot of managers aren't getting reflective supervision, so they're not providing reflective supervision. So it fits all the way up. There needs to be almost like an ethos embedded in the organisation that everybody needs to have reflective supervision. So this isn't just for frontline practitioners, this is for everybody. Reflective supervision is really important, I think, for everybody, and that space and an acknowledgement that reflection is important. I also think that critical friendships matter. I mean, you talked about that earlier, didn't you? But just having that person who will ask you questions that you've not thought about, you know, will engage you in a reflective conversation. And I wonder whether we need to formalise that a bit more now, because if you like, when we were all in a busy team together, people would just kind of informally find someone that they could bounce ideas off, and it was almost like an informal critical friendships developed within teams. But actually, now that we're working in this different way, especially when someone is new to a team, you know, I mean, I've been talking to people who are 6 months into their job who've never met some of their team members. You know, I've talked to managers who've never met the new team members, you know. So I think critical friendships being developed in that same informal way is more difficult. So perhaps one of the things that we really need is almost that, I was going to use the word permission, but I almost want to take it further than permission, to almost like a requirement to create a critical friendship, not just a permission to do it, but a requirement to have critical friendships where you'll check in with one another through the day, or if you need to talk about something, you've got that. I think that matters outside of reflective supervision. I think also, you know, improved models, ownership of models, teams having models. I know some teams do things like a model of the week for reflection, or, you know, that they create their own model that they use. So I think something more around more dialogue about different models of reflection, I think that would definitely help. And then there's a bit of a curveball here that isn't really talked about very much at all in the UK, but is intervision. So, I mean, that's very big in Scandinavia and a lot of the Germanic countries, and, you know, it's quite widely used in other areas of Europe. But intervision is, and it's just really hard for us to understand almost over here. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but we would think about group supervision, but group supervision is different. Intervision is about a group of people coming together who are all peers, if you like. So there's no manager running it or facilitating, it's just all peers coming together. But the focus is not on here where we have group supervision. People tend to bring one, you know, piece of work, you know, and they take it in turns. I'll bring a case and we'll all talk about it, and we'll all, where intervision isn't about that at all. It's not about case discussion, it's about you as a worker. So it's you talking about how you're feeling about your practice at the moment, the impact that practice is having on you. And I think that sort of really bringing people together to talk about themselves in the context of their working practice is really helpful. I think it encourages and increases reflective abilities and emotional intelligence and all of that. So there's, if you like, a wish list of something I would love to see, but that we don't really have at the moment. But that's something I think we could really be working towards. So it doesn't replace supervision, and you still need reflective supervision, and you could still have group supervision, but supervision and intervision offer two different things, I think. And I'd like to see a growth of intervision in this country. That's my thoughts.
That's something I haven't heard of before, and I think it's really interesting. And I think that would help social workers develop and work on that emotional intelligence, really understanding what our emotions are, what they mean, why we're feeling like that. So I think that's definitely something exciting to explore further. But to go back to the other points you made as well, which were exactly the kind of things that came to my mind when I was thinking about the key things, having that space and supervision that should be available to everybody, managers alike, but how that space also needs to be a safe space where you feel like you can talk honestly. I think I was on a webinar recently where somebody said that we're not always honest about our feelings in supervision because we're scared of being judged. We're scared that people will think we're not very good social workers or we're not doing our job properly. So that space and that relationship you develop with your supervisor or the person that's doing a group reflective session or within your team, that critical friend, it has to be somebody that you can speak openly and honestly with. And that's something that needs to be worked on, I think, in terms of a relationship. And then lastly, just what you were saying about having that critical friend, I definitely think that's a really positive way forward for social workers. I think as a practitioner, I definitely had a team member who I knew that I could always have very open, frank discussions with, and who I knew would maybe challenge me, but without making it feel really uncomfortable. So I knew it would never affect our friendship, even though she might say to me, you know, why are you doing it that way? Or do you think you're doing that in the right way? because that's what it's about. It's about having somebody to share those ideas and thoughts with, and somebody that you trust enough to kind of have those open discussions with.
That's really interesting, isn't it? That it's all about relationships, you know, and we've said reflection and social work are essentially one and the same. Well, you know, relationships is the key in social work, in the same way maybe it's the key in reflection. So that's really interesting. But then the other thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that need to be able to be open and honest and not feel like you're being judged, I also think that goes back a little bit to our training, because students, you know, and I know I've done this myself as well, if you're writing a reflective account that's going to be marked, you're not always honest. You think about, well, what's going to meet the learning criteria and what's going to get me the highest grade? And you're not necessarily going to say exactly how you felt. You're going to say, oh, and I used this bit of theory because that comes. So I think it almost starts us off from the basis of, well, reflection is about what other people think of you and how you're going to be judged and how you're going to be marked. And so that's quite interesting, isn't it? I don't know how we get over that, because I think there's always going to be an element of, when you are writing a reflection that's for CPD even, you know, I did a reflective piece over the weekend that I uploaded to the regulator, and I'm not, I mean, I think I was largely honest, but I probably threw in a few bits that I thought, oh, that'll meet that CPD requirement. So I think we're not always, when we're doing reflection for something else, for a purpose, it's not always reflection, truly reflection. But, you know, let's maybe just be more honest about that and just say, okay, sometimes when we're writing a reflection, we are doing that to meet particular criteria. And so it's just being more honest about it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that made me think about the work that we do with individuals and families, and thinking about that relationship and really the parallels of what we do as social workers, but what we do within our interventions with families, because we're expecting families to be open and honest with us about things, when we know there are times that they might be saying the things that we want to hear, the same as what you just said about what we might do in our reflective spaces as well. So it's interesting, isn't it, how it all kind of parallels with each other.
Absolutely. Well, people are people, and that's always going to be people, isn't it? Well, I think the virtual world has changed everything, really, hasn't it? So, of course, it is going to have an impact on reflection. And I don't know yet if I've got lots of answers for it, because, you know, I've been working on supporting people with reflective practice probably for about 25 years, and this has only been like the last year or so. But there's a few things that I think we can really think about in terms of the virtual world. One is that I think at the moment people are literally clicking in and out of meetings. So there's no time for those, you know, what we might call transitional moments, moving between things. You know, even like the car was always a big place for social workers to, you know, reflect, driving between visits or driving even home at the end of the day. You know, there'd always be a place where I'd get to, and I think when I get to there, I'll stop thinking about work, I'll start thinking about home. So I think reflection, we've always done that in those moments of transition between things. We're not in the car as much now, so that's having an impact. And then those moments of transition are gone when you're clicking in and out of meetings. So one thing that I think is really important, and I always try and model myself if I'm, you know, in meetings with people virtually, is if your meeting is scheduled, I don't know, from 10 to 11, that you finish at 10 to 11, so that then there's 10 minutes before the person is going to click into the next meeting, which is bound to be starting at 11, so that there's always some time that's allowed, which is, I think, time away from the screen to process what you've just done, to think about what you've just done. So I think that's really important for the virtual world. And I would ask managers just to think about how are they providing moments of transition for social workers to be able to reflect in those moments of transition. So that's one thing I think we need to do. Another thing, I suppose, links back to what we've talked about already, is about maybe formalising things like virtual friendships, maybe making sure that there is enough time in the day for people to come together somehow, just for that informal conversation. So I think those things are important. And then, as you know, because you took it out and did it across the project area, then I worked with Bridget Caffrey, a colleague, and we developed a specific model for group reflection, which was all about adapting to online group, groups coming together in a virtual way, if you like. So there are, I think, specific models that we could use that have been developed for the online world. Because I do think, even if you think about just social work theory generally, a lot of things have gone out of date now because of the way we're working in a different way. So maybe some of the models of reflection need to be adapted to think about new ways of working, virtual ways of working. So I suppose they're the main things. I suppose if there was only one thing I could do, I would say create those moments of transition for people. Even some people I know have literally been going out and sitting in their car for 10 minutes and playing some music and coming back in again, just to mark the finishing the working day and coming back to home. So I think transition is important to enable us to process and reflect. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's definitely something that I've picked up on through the work that I've done in the project as well. So I think I felt quite fortunate really to be able to still continue my work across when it changed to the virtual platform, and still was able to do everything that I'd hoped to do. So we're still able to offer one-to-one sessions, group sessions, and that's when I came across the reflective connections. And I think just providing that space for people, and I was able to do that. So I felt really fortunate for being able to do that. But some of the things that came out of it, like you were saying, was that people were missing that, not traveling in the car and having that space to reflect after a visit or on the way home. And people would talk to me about how they would maybe change their clothes at the end of the working day, even though they were still working at home, just so that they felt that they were no longer working, or take the dog for a walk straight after work, or things like that. So it's interesting to hear, isn't it? Because it comes back to what you were saying earlier about that kind of self-care as well, that we're making sure that we're still kind of looking after our own well-being as workers. And even more so now because of working virtually, I think we have to make sure we're taking those moments. And I think what you were saying about having that time at the end of a meeting is kind of really good advice that we could take hold of, really. Make sure you finish a meeting 5 minutes earlier, just so that you've got some headspace before going into the next one, really.
I think if we're asking people to reflect for action and think about what you're going to do, you've got to give them a few minutes to prepare in that time, haven't you? So what's interesting, though, is what you drew out there. And of course, I didn't think about it when I was talking, but some of the advantages that have come from the virtual world, and they have. So things like being able to bring people together for group conversations, and I've been able to have one-to-one sessions with managers who are really wanting to develop their reflective skills in supervision. So, and we wouldn't have been able to do that previously. So I've been able to change my work, I think, in a way that responds more to what people need for reflective support, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's really good to think about, because I think we all have had to adapt, but also to learn about how we can actually do things virtually, and actually those opportunities, like you say. It made me think about, with the reflective connection sessions that we ran for the workers, we kind of consulted with managers and staff and kind of asked what would kind of work best for them, because we did a lot of focus on just doing team sessions, group reflective sessions, which was really good because I think it brought about that sense of connection within the team. But we were also keen to kind of build those connections across the whole of the workforce. And Gwynedd is a vast area. So doing it virtually meant that I could have people from teams across the county coming together in the same session, which wouldn't have worked as well if it was kind of done face to face.
Yeah, I suppose because you are so geographically vast, that actually is a really helpful thing. I think what I would say in answer to this question is it doesn't always aid reflection, because poor quality supervision, or supervision that's just about how many cases have you got, have you done this, have you closed that, what's the latest, have you done your stat visit on time, that's all about data gathering, doesn't aid reflection. And in actual fact, I think it can hinder reflection in some ways, can almost be the opposite, because a worker you know, come into that, especially say if you're a very new worker and you don't have previous experience of supervision. Maybe think that's what social work is about. It's about just gathering data and crunching that and making sure targets are met or whatever, rather than actually really being reflective. So poor supervision doesn't aid reflection, but I think good quality supervision really gets the worker to dig deeper, and maybe it gives them a different perspective. Because I think a good supervisor asks you an unexpected question. They ask you a question that you hadn't even thought of, and that's what makes it really reflective, because it makes you think. You know, anything that makes you think is reflective. But if you go into supervision, it doesn't make you think, because you've just got a list of, this is when my last stat visit was, this is, it's just facts. You know, anything that makes you think really enhances your reflection. I think, though, it's much like, as we've said throughout this, it's much like social work. If you're a social worker asking a family just, you know, for information-based questions, all you're going to get is information-based stuff coming back. And then it makes evaluation of information much more difficult. Whereas if you're asking questions that really make that parent think about their parenting and about their child's situation, that's really going to enhance your intervention. And, you know, that's why your assessment can be an intervention in its own right, if you're exploring things in the right kind of way. So I suppose it's that bit about the way supervision is done can enhance reflection, but it can also limit reflection. I think that's the starting point from my perspective. But I mean, what about from your perspective in terms of, in practice, what really works in supervision, do you think?
I think definitely having that space and somebody to ask you those, like you say, unexpected questions, but also to dig that little bit deeper. So it's not just process driven, like you say, that we are asking people about what emotions that brought for them, for the family or the individual that they're working with, and what effect has come from that. So, you know, it's unpicking things again, isn't it? And just going that bit deeper. And how do you do that? Is that just through questioning, or do you use tools to support you? So I think it can be quite creative, but it can also, like you say, fall back to that process stuff, because, you know, there are boxes to tick. And we need to make sure we do that bit, but we also need to make sure that we're offering that kind of space for people to reflect and really think about their actions and feelings and emotions and everything that's interlinked to that, really.
I suppose, again, it's just about that, bringing that connection with practice over again, isn't it? When we're working with families, there are boxes that we need to tick. There's some information that we just simply have to have. But then if we use creative tools in our direct work, then we're going to get more from that. It's going to create potentially just more opportunity for change and growth and development. And I suppose now more than ever, I think social work needs to be creative, and that, you know, you can only be creative as a practitioner if the support that you receive is creative, if your supervision is creative, you know, if the supervision is asking you questions that you think, you know, that was actually a really good question, really made me think, I could try using that question with that parent next week. So it's that model in the model almost, isn't it, really? And I think that's why, you know, that's how you bring good supervision skills and good social work skills together. And it's that bringing of those together that creates a harmony that I think provides reflective space within supervision. So I think that is really important.
Yeah, I think that point about modelling is really interesting, because I think there's a lot that we can take. I think sometimes we can go into supervision expecting just answers from a manager, like, I want you to tell me what to do and just fix it for me, when we know in social work we shouldn't be doing that with families. So why are we doing that ourselves as social workers? And it is about, as well, the managers having the support. And I think I really like the work that you're doing in Gwynedd to try and support managers to reflect on their reflective supervision, so that, you know, that they're thinking about kind of the way that they're approaching things, and that they're also having that time as well to to think about it and reflect, because I'm sure, you know, managers are also very busy going from one thing to the next, from meeting to meeting. How many supervisions do they do in a day? So the more that we support everybody from the top down, I think the better it is all round.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we said earlier that universities often teach one or two models of reflection, or really keep, you know, the large focus on those couple of models. But there are so many different models of reflection. And, you know, if you try to pin it down, it's really difficult, because there are lots of different models of reflection, but there are also other models that you can adapt to use as a reflective tool. So there are so many different things that we can use, and they all offer different things, you know. And so saying, what do reflective models offer? Different models offer different things. I think one key thing for me that has been really helpful, and people, when I'm delivering training on reflection, people always comment on how helpful it was to understand this, is for people to get hold of what's the difference between a process model of reflection and a component model. And, you know, very briefly, then a process model is a model that is only used to look back at a situation. So it nearly always starts off with what happened, because you're looking back at something. And then it will take you through a series of steps of, you know, something like, I mean, classically, a process model will say, what were you thinking and feeling, and what went well and what didn't go well? What have you learned? What will you do differently next time? Those kinds of questions. Whereas a component model can be used at any stage. You could use it to reflect before you do something. A component model really just says, think about these components, these issues in your practice. So, you know, a component model like the Big Six just gives you 6 things to focus on when you're reflecting. I find that actually component models, to me, offer a lot more. Now, that might be just because I prefer those, you know, and different people prefer different models. But I find that a component model offers, it helps us move towards analysis. And I think sometimes that's a big step for social workers, is how do we analyse the information that we've gathered? How do I analyse this situation? How do I analyse what's happening for this family? And analysis and reflection, although they're connected, they are different, you know. I think really reflection is often about yourself, and practice analysis is often about a situation or information that you've gathered. But there's lots of other differences between reflection and analysis. But a component model, because it just says think about these things, often really helps with analysis. So I think that's one key thing that models can offer. But then you just look at different models offer different things. So, for example, a classic process model, say like Gibbs' model of reflection, which has been around for years and it is still the most commonly taught model in social work training. That offers a lot for looking at a single incident and breaking it down or unpicking it, you know, to use your words. It breaks it down. It helps you to think about different aspects of something that has already happened. Whereas, say, something like the weather model is what that offers, I think, is quite different. Some people use the weather model to look at a single incident in time. I don't find it's that helpful for that. But I find that the weather model is great for looking back at a period of time. So say, for example, and I know some people use this in direct work, say, for example, you wanted to work towards helping a family to understand change that's happened in their family. Perhaps you're coming towards the end of your work with them. You might want to talk to them about, okay, let's look at the journey that you've been on as a family, and let's think about the weather along the journey. You know, can you tell me what's been the sunshine moment for you as a family over the last few months? You know, what's been the rainy moment? What does that mean for you? Have there been any storms? How have you what's happened in the storms? How have you got through them? You know, has there been any lightning? And often people will talk about what surprised them or what, you know, but people will talk about different things using the weather model over a period of time. I think that offers something different. To say Gibbs, you couldn't sit down with a family and say, we're going to look at I've been working with you now for 6 months and we're just about to, close, or we're about to transfer, or whatever it is we're doing. So let's look back at those 6 months. You couldn't use Gibbs, because if you start off with, well, what happened? 100 things have happened in those 6 months, but you could use the weather model. So I think different models offer different things, and that's why it's really important that I think we teach and learn a range of different models, you know. So there's I mean, one that I love that I think really helps if you're doing you know, if you're doing a social work assessment and you really want to delve into the analysis, then I love Corsican's Reflective Onion, and I think it can really provide a good tool for analysing in that situation. So I suppose what I'd say is there are loads of models, and what they can offer, they all offer something different. But maybe the one thing that all of them offer is a sense of structure. And it's what makes something become reflection rather than just thinking. You know, if you're just thinking, very often you get tied up in a load of spaghetti, and you know, it's just kind of like your head's like all fogged up and you're just thinking. But if you use a model of reflection, it just gives you a structure. So it gives you a structure, and you know that you've thought about key things. And so I think that's what they all have in common, that they offer. They all offer structure, but then they all have different advantages and disadvantages, I suppose. What about your thoughts? What models do you like? I mean, I've said, you know, I love Corsican's Onion, I like Weather. There's some that I really like and I use a lot. There's others that I'd recognise they have value, but I don't use them as much. You know, I just use them in certain circumstances. What about you? What models do you like?
I think traditionally my brain has always gone towards process models. So when I started experimenting a bit more with component models, it was much more of a challenge for me, because I like things to kind of go around in a circle or a particular way. So I feel like I've worked really hard and looked at different models and tried different ones out and kind of tried to look at what works for me. But the one I'm always drawn to is the surprises to learning one. I just find that really useful, really simple. And like you were saying about that structure, it just gives you something to work through. Because I think you can just reflect on something and try and think about kind of what happened and what went on with that. But I think the specific headings that you get from the model are what takes it that much deeper for you. And then that really builds on that self-awareness, I think, and what your thinking is and why you're thinking it and things. So definitely, yeah, I would say that I've changed as a practitioner over the last few years because I've been experimenting more and building confidence with using them. And I think, just to link to what we were doing in the project in terms of developing our own reflective models, which I think can be quite scary for some people, because if you don't think you're particularly creative, you can think, gosh, I wouldn't know what to do. But, you know, we had that opportunity to bring together team members from across children's services in Gwynedd and the training department. We all worked really closely together, and with yourself, to learn about models, but also then to have a go at developing some. And, you know, they're going to feature in the booklet that you spoke about earlier. And I think not only does it help people understand reflection and reflective models, but it also brings that sense of ownership within the teams, I think, because that person then can explain it to people, they can sell it to people, they can show how it's used in practice. And hopefully then people will have a go at trying these new models and see if they like them and how they can be used. And just one thing that you said as well that I thought was really useful was to think about models in a way that they can be kind of multi-purpose. So it doesn't have to be just be used in reflection, that you can actually use it as direct work. And I don't think a lot of us as social workers would have thought about it in that way.
Yeah, but I do think models of reflection can be so widely used. And but I like what you said there, that word ownership. I think that's really important when people, you know, I always encourage people to create their own models, and sometimes think people are a bit scared of that. But I think there's a real learning to it, because, well, it helps you to learn what is a model and what makes a model, if you like. And very often what I find is social workers create a kind of combined model. They always like a bit of process, but a bit of component. And so it's a bit of both, really. And we found that, didn't we, in the models that we created. But I also like the fact that, you know, in the models created, 2 of them were very specific to the Welsh context, which I also really like, you know, to actually feel like, if you like, as a social worker in Wales, you can see yourself in that model. So it's not just ownership for the person that created it or for the team, but it's also about seeing yourself in something. And I do think a lot of the models that we use in social work don't come from social work, and that, you know, I think we should have more models created within social work by practitioners, because then we can see ourselves and our own practice in that work. So I think that's really important. So, and I think, you know, the models that were created in those sessions that we had together were really, really good. And I was worried, will we be able to do it in the same way online? Because I always used to do that, you know, get people around a flip chart and with pens, and when you're working together, it's easier to create. And I wondered whether it was going to work doing that virtually, but it really did work virtually, and it worked really well, and the models that people came up with were great. So I'm glad that a number of those have gone into the booklet, really, because they're good models.
Yeah, and I think it showed as well how collaboration can work really well. And that's one of the kind of key features of the project. So we were keen to make sure that, you know, we're always including the workers and the managers and the teams in the work that we were doing. And it's also the same, isn't it? Going back again to what we're saying about our practice with families, we need to be involving families, doing with, not doing to. So the more we can do that, we're going to build that sense of ownership within them to make changes. And it's the same principle that we kind of used in this kind of approach to making our own models as well.
Absolutely. So I suppose in a way, this links back to our previous question, what we've just said about how, well, different models offer different things. So we have to take different approaches to group sessions and group reflection, I suppose, for a variety of reasons. I think, well, one thing is every group's going to be different, you know, and the purpose is going to be different. So you might have a group of senior managers, or you might have a group of students or a group of practitioners, or you might have a very mixed group. And so, you know, with a senior manager and some practitioners and some students and some, you know, so it's the group is going to be different. So you've got to tailor the approach to the group. But also you're going to want to use different approaches at times. I mean, I suppose I always like, whenever I'm doing a group session, to always draw something out at the end of it that connects people, each of the individuals in that session. There's something that connects them. And so that's where the reflective connections model came in there, about those drawing out the connections together. So I always like to do that, but then I like to use different methods of reflection or different models to structure the conversations, or you know, so I'm just thinking about sessions I've done recently, and one session that I really like to do at the moment is, especially because people are working from home, you know, I ask people to, I introduce the activity, and then we have 10 minutes away from the computer screen. And during that 10 minutes, they need to find an object that they bring back that says, look, here's how I'm feeling about my work at the moment. And sometimes people bring something that's really literal, you know, like, I don't know, somebody's bought a rubbish bin and I feel a bit rubbish, and it's, you know, full of rubbish. And sometimes people, it's a lot more just a kind of analogy, and it's a lot more reflective, and it's a lot more, but then drawing the connections out between the objects at the end, and then that gives a connection between feelings, is a really lovely way of working. So you've still got that overall approach of, here's the connectivity, but every method that I use is different. And it might be because, well, I worked with this group a month or 6 weeks ago, so I want to use a different method. Or it might just be that I want to keep it fresh, so I'm using a different method if I'm facilitating it. Because if I use the same method every time, I'm going to get bored of that, and I'm going to get, you know, and everything needs to be creative and mixed up and kept fresh. So I think that's why you need to use different approaches and go about things in a different way. But for me, one of the underlying things has to be, how do we get everybody to equally contribute? Because I think very often in any kind of group conversation, whether it's a reflection or anything else, you know, some people will talk a lot and some people will take a backseat and not talk much at all. And I think one of the big advantages for me of this new online way of working is it makes it really easy, because you give each person a number of minutes and everybody else is on mute. And so you don't get that where people are jumping in, and you can put some very simple rules in place that mean everyone contributes. So I suppose they're the two underlying things that I try and make sure of so they're I suppose an overall approach that never changes is making sure everyone has space, and making sure that somehow I give some connectivity between all of the group members. But then otherwise, I think it's really important to just mix everything up, to keep it fresh and to keep it reflective and to keep it in some ways fun. You know, reflection, when we're thinking about it as self-care, it should be fun, it should be exciting, it should have something to offer. It shouldn't feel like a chore, because when it feels like a chore, you're never going to do it on your own, you know. So I suppose they're my thoughts about group reflections. But I mean, you've had a lot of experience of delivering some group sessions during the project work. So, you know, what are your thoughts about different approaches?
Yeah, I suppose it's been really good actually, because we've had the opportunity to try different things. And I think historically, there's always been that, like you say, maybe an action learning set type of group session where one person brings a case, and it can be quite daunting for people, really. So we started off with that kind of approach, and we thought, okay, how can we maybe look at it a little bit differently? So we did come up with a new approach to that kind of action learning, which we brought in a CLEAR model. So that comes from coaching. And what we liked about that is that it offered just a little bit of structure, really. So it starts with contracting, listening, exploring, and then moving on to action and review. But again, I think there's always a danger with that kind of approach, that you can fall into that trap that we do as social workers sometimes, of trying to fix things and say, have you done this? Did you try this? Rather than allowing that space for somebody to really reflect. So I think there's definitely a space for all the different types of group approaches. And we definitely played about with a bit of that. And then we thought about, okay, how could we do it differently? So I began then doing some sessions where I would do a bit of kind of sharing information and using reflection in the same session. So we'd pick a specific topic, which might have been about reflective practice, or it might have been about something within the project to do with outcomes, or and then we'd have a discussion about some of the learning behind that and some of the information. And then we'd have a lot of kind of group discussions then about what that meant to them, how they'd use certain things in their practice. So I really liked that then, that we were kind of using things and everybody was kind of offering something and taking that time. And then later on in the project, I came across the reflective connections model, and you were doing some training. Gosh, it's going back a while now, maybe a year ago. And I saw it advertised and thought, oh, that's something that could work really well for our project. And I think instantly, I just felt an instant connection with what it offered as a model. One, because obviously it could be done online, and that's something that then we could continue with the project. But two, because it gave everybody the same opportunity. It wasn't that pressure on one person to do a lot of the talking. But not only that, I think that it brings that sense of actually you're practicing using models, you're practicing your active listening and that communication, which is so important and one of the main elements of the project, really. And then it brought that sense of connection, and people really value that. Just one, having the time, but also number two, just hearing other people's stories. And there's so much to learn from it. And I think I felt so privileged just to be able to be a part of that, to facilitate the sessions, because you're hearing a lot of the time as social workers, we talk about things that we found difficult rather than the things that went well. So you're hearing about a lot of the anxiety, a lot of emotions, a lot of the difficulties that people have found in work. But at the same time, you're also seeing kind of what people are getting out of that, what they've taken from it, those learning moments, and how that is going to then be applied in their own practice. So I think there's a lot to be said, really, for that model that you've developed with Bridget.
I think listening to you there, though, I kind of learn from listening about how another reason that different approaches are important is that at different times we need to have different things in place, and sometimes something runs its course. So, and there's a place for all of those things that you did, you know, each of those different ways of having reflective conversations with teams, or even with just workers who are not all in the same team, the way in which you've done it differently, but you know, at different times it kind of runs its course. So you do that, everybody brings a situation, has a conversation about it, but then people start to think, oh, I've done that before, I don't need to go, and you'll get people not buying into it. So I think if you keep it mixed up and you keep it new and you keep it fresh each time, people don't know what's coming, what we're going to do this session, you know. So I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that I've enjoyed doing really as working in this new online way is finding lots of different methods for groups, and then thinking about, okay, how do I use, and how might that method be useful to them in their own practice. And because all of those methods are, you know, the one I mentioned earlier about the object, there's nothing to stop you doing that with a young person, to say, you know, is there an object that represents how you're feeling? And it's just that it builds on the idea of third object theory. And so, but every technique that you use, there needs to be a variety of ways in which that can be used, I think. And there's a time and a place for every approach, isn't there, and every way of working.
Yeah, definitely.
This is quite a tricky one, isn't it, about advice? I'm never sure about the word advice. I suppose it comes from that, being a social worker, you don't want to give advice to people, or you don't want to, you know, and it kind of sets you up in a way. What advice would you give? Because we can all give advice. I suppose, though, the thing is, I have been a social worker for 31 years. I've been working on reflective practice, writing about it, training on it for more than 20 years. So maybe there is something that I can offer from that experience. But what's really difficult is, I would actually give different people different advice. I think it almost needs to be, if you are giving advice and using that word, it needs to be tailored, doesn't it, to that individual and the circumstance that they're in. But maybe you would need to work through questions like some of the questions we've asked today. And I'm just thinking this now as we've come to this final question, but it's almost, think about those questions for yourself. You know, what does reflective practice mean to you? Why is reflective practice important to you? What are the barriers for you? And then it comes out with your, if you like, your unique framework for reflection. And then you could look for unique advice based around that. So I'd give everybody different advice, but maybe there's some key things that I'd say, and I've probably already said them in the conversation, to be honest, but one is, be kind to yourself. Don't use reflective practice in a way to beat yourself up. That's important. Yes, there are always things we can learn, and yes, we do need to be open to learning and to change, but we also need to be kind to ourselves and think about what we've done well. So I suppose that's one piece. And if you're a manager, the advice is, don't always keep asking people, what will you do differently? Also say to them, you know, give them feedback and say, that was a great piece of work and you could maybe use this. What could you use from this that you could use again? So that kindness, I think, is really important. I think being open to creative approaches really matters. So an experience that I had recently, not within the project, but where I met with a group of like senior social workers and gave them a technique that I said, this could be a really good technique for you to use in groups. And they, if I'm honest with you, at the end of the session, our agreement was I'd give them a technique, they'd go and use it, and then we'd come back again in a month's time or so and talk and have another technique. And they would, so it was really to encourage them to go away and sort of do reflective conversations. And I did this technique with them and they were like, oh no, people won't like that. No, people won't like that. To be fair to them, they gave it a go. And then the following month they came back and they went, I am amazed. It went brilliant. People loved it, you know. And I think what's really important is they were very open, you know. They were skeptical at first, but then they used it. They didn't let that skepticism hold them back. They did use it. And I think that was a key learning moment for them, that here's something I don't think will work, but actually it did work really well. So I suppose it's about being open, especially as a supervisor. If you hear a technique and you think, oh no, that doesn't really work for me, it doesn't encourage me to be reflective, or even I tried it with that worker and it didn't work for them, different things work for different people. So be open to trying out different things. And as a worker, be open into testing out an idea, and don't think, oh no, I won't, that won't help me to reflect. Be open, and the more open you are, the more you'll get from it. So I think it's about just openness matters. And maybe in a way, I don't know if it's the wrong word, but, you know, we're working in children and families here, but playfulness almost, you know, be willing to be playful with reflection. We know how helpful play is for children, and how play really enhances learning and development for children, and it shouldn't really be much different for us as adults. Creativity and play and fun helps our learning. So be open to playing around with ideas on reflection, and making your own reflective model, and testing out, you know, silly techniques, but giving just everything a go. You know, be open and give everything a go. I suppose they're the two main things that for me could be advice to everybody. But then other things, there might be, you know, one person listening might think, oh, I really want to give you this advice or this advice because I think this would really work for you. You know, I remember years ago working with a student who was brilliant in practice, but wasn't great at reflective writing, and we did quite a lot of work about using different models, and she swapped from using a particular model in her reflective writing to another model, and her grades went up like 20% or something. I mean, I'm not guaranteeing that's going to happen for everybody, but unique advice, tailored. So just really being open to you developing your individual tools and having an individual toolkit for reflection, I suppose, and that would be different for everybody. So maybe that's my advice. It doesn't really make any sense to say I'd give everybody individual advice, but that's I suppose it's that individuality of reflection.
Yeah.
What would your advice be?
Yeah, it's like you say, I'm not sure advice is maybe the best thing, but in terms of, I suppose, what I've learned as a worker and across the project, I really like what you said about that concept of the toolkit, because I think we use that and we understand that as social workers, that we can dip in and out of different things. And I suppose it's around not being afraid of trying different things. So you were saying about being open to new things. And I think sometimes we can be our own worst enemy because we might be just a bit scared of getting it wrong. And I think with reflection, it isn't right or wrong in a sense, because it's so individual and unique, like you were saying. So don't be scared that you might say the wrong thing or you might think the wrong thing, because it comes back to you and your feelings and your experience. And only through exploring that and developing those skills are you going to become more self-aware and become better at it, I suppose. So yeah, definitely. Don't be afraid to try new things, and don't be afraid to get it wrong, because there isn't really a right or wrong in reflection. And I suppose the other thing, what we've spoken about today that really stood out for me was about remember that link between reflection and self-care, because we know that reflection can help mitigate some of that stress. So whether that is through group reflection, supervision, a critical friend, reflective writing, a journal, whatever it may be, it's going to help you in some way. So I would kind of hang on to that in my own mind.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, actually. I liked the way as well where you summarised that all the different tools that we can use, like reflective writing, critical friendship, group reflection, reflection in supervision, you know, that transitional moment reflection. There's so many different spaces, aren't there, really, for reflection? So I really like that advice. So here's an example of modelling the model, and we weren't planning on doing this at all, Wendy, but when you mentioned earlier that you really like the surprises to learning method, it comes from that, I don't know if you know, but it comes from the collaborative model of direct observation, which was developed years ago. I think it was 2000 actually, and it was a model of directly observing students that was developed at the University of York. And as part of that model, they suggested that you concluded everything after you've done the direct observation, you've given the feedback and everything, that you conclude the whole thing with those 4 headings: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, and learning. And over the years, I found those 4 are so good to just conclude any activity in a reflective way. So when you said it earlier, I was thinking, well, of course, because that offers, you know, that particular method really offers a great conclusion to reflection. So maybe we should conclude our conversation using that. So we haven't prepared for this at all, but let's just go ahead and model the model, and each of us can share based on our reflective conversation today, our surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, and learning, and we'll see where we go. So I would say my surprise, that the first thing that comes to my head when I think about surprises and the conversation that we've had today is how many, we've had so many conversations about the project and about supporting reflection within the project and how that can be done. And, you know, I've really enjoyed working with you because you've been really open to new ideas. We've had all those conversations. But what's really struck me today is the structure of these 10 questions that you know, you had the questions, and then we just said, we'll have a conversation about those questions. I've learned so much more from you listening to it, because maybe the structured conversation of here are the questions, because previously when we've met, our conversations have almost not had a structure, and sometimes they've gone off in different directions, which in some ways has been helpful because it's been creative and open and, oh, what about this idea? What about that idea? But maybe today, because we've had a structure, I don't know, I've maybe just sat and listened more. I've not been thinking about what do I want to say. I've really truly listened to what you've been saying. I don't know, but I feel like I've learned so much more about what's been helpful in the project just from listening to your answers to the questions. And that's been a surprise, because we've met so many times before, I had so many conversations before, but maybe the 10 questions, maybe that would be a really good thing to do for supervision, or a reflective conversation with a critical friend. Maybe it's a good method. Here's maybe not 10 questions, but here's 3 questions that we're going to have a conversation about. And it's not just a one way, it's a both people answering the same question. I don't know, it's worked really well because I've learned a lot about the project. So that's my surprise. What about your surprise today then?
I suppose it's how you can condense so much information, I think, into such short answers. Because I think reflection, really, we could have sat all day and spoken about all these different questions, what it brings to mind, what it means, and we could have delved into a lot of things, I think. So I think having that structure, like you were saying, it's surprising that you can kind of condense it down but still have those kind of key important messages.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so satisfactions then. I suppose I've had a few satisfactions. Some of them are very practical, and they're almost immediate satisfactions that may not work later. Because one of the satisfactions is it seems to have recorded okay, but when I come to watching it back, that might not be a satisfaction because maybe it hasn't recorded all right, you know. So I think some of that shows the difference between surface and deeper. It might be an immediate satisfaction, but maybe later it's not, when we see what the actual video turns out like. So, but I'm thinking, oh, it's gone smoothly, we've got it done, you know. So I suppose that's a satisfaction, but is it a long-term one? Maybe one of the big satisfactions is, I think, although we didn't write it like this, the questions actually seem to have led one into another. So there seems to have been almost a connection in the conversation. So even though it's had these questions, that the conversation seems to have flowed actually from my perspective. So I think that's a satisfaction. Yeah. What about your satisfactions?
So I think because we've had that time, like you say, to take a step back and unpick the different things, I think it's a satisfaction for me to kind of feel that sense of achievement of what's been done through the project and this work that we've been doing with yourself. So it's really satisfying to feel like we've offered different things to workers that hopefully is having an impact on practice. So just thinking about the different approaches we've used, the different things we've brought in, the different people we've connected with, that hopefully it's going to have a positive impact on children and families and individuals that we work with, really.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just wondering whether that begins to create my dissatisfaction. I don't know if that sounds right, really, but I think one of the things I'm always dissatisfied with around reflection is the use of models that don't come from social work. You know, the most commonly taught models come largely from health or education backgrounds. And I feel like, you know, social work and reflection are so connected and intrinsically linked. And sometimes I really get quite frustrated about why aren't we using more models developed by social workers? And I suppose in a way that is a bit of a dissatisfaction, is that, you know, the work that you've been doing within the project, and of course the reflective element of the project is one tiny part of the whole project. You know, the project's been very significant in terms of looking at social work with children and families across the area. And so it's only one aspect, but maybe a dissatisfaction is, I think the more that I've learned about what you've been doing in the project, it's enhanced my learning and my understanding. And I wonder whether there's so much really good work being done by social workers all over the UK. And those pockets of practice, who's picking those up? Who's sharing those? Who's, you know, I'd love to have another conversation with you that is just literally highlighting, look, these are the key parts of the project that we've done that other people can watch, and it becomes shared outside of your own area. So maybe that's a dissatisfaction, that I think there's so much excellent practice that social workers do, but I suppose much like the issues earlier, we keep focused so much on what isn't going well. Are we really sharing that fabulous stuff that is going really well in social work? And so maybe that's my dissatisfaction. We're not sharing it enough with one another, and we'd learn such a lot from listening to one another. I think that's my dissatisfaction. What about your dissatisfaction?
So I think on reflection and thinking about all the things that we've discussed throughout this conversation, I suppose my dissatisfaction is the frustration that I know as a practitioner how important reflective practice is. And all our discussions today have highlighted some of the key points, some things to take away, some practical things. But how easy is that to do in practice becomes that going back to the barriers and things, just thinking about, do we give enough time to it, and do we allow ourselves that time really? So the dissatisfaction for me is knowing the importance, but giving it the time that it deserves. And it's just so difficult to do as a social worker, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those barriers that are in place. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then we've got learning, and I always think it's interesting when you use this method, because it's not a specific question, is it? It's not like, you know, you don't say, well, what was your surprise today, or what was your learning today? It's just learning. And so I conclude supervision sessions using this method. I think I've told you that before, but, you know, very often I'll get to learning, and sometimes people will tell me about the key thing they've learned, or they'll tell me something about their learning environment. So it can be a whole range of different things. And I think when I've used this method for myself, I've almost always gone with learning being what I've learned in that session. So I use it sometimes when I'm doing a reflective account for the regulator, and I usually conclude my reflective account with surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. And nearly always learning is about what I've learned. But actually today my thinking around learning is a bit different. What I've been thinking is, I think this conversation has been, I've learned a lot from it. I think I said that in my surprise about how much I've learned that I didn't kind of know before. But I also think that maybe listening to conversations is a key learning tool for students and new workers. I mean, we know that anyway, don't we? I know that, you know, if you're in a really busy office and you're new to a role, even not as a student, even as an experienced worker, but you're new to a role, you overhear conversations and you think, oh, I like the way they did that, I'll try that. Or I like, you know, so listening into conversations can be a real helpful learning tool. But I'm wondering about whether in this online world, how can we replicate those conversations for people to overhear? And maybe what we've done today is replicated a conversation about reflection for people to overhear. And I wonder if we could do a bit more of that to enhance learning. So I'm thinking about, I've just thought this is a really good learning tool, I suppose.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
What about your learning?
I think one of the main things that struck me and I think is really useful is what you said about a reflective model being kind of multi-purpose, that it doesn't have to be just for you to use to reflect on a situation, that it can be used as a direct work tool with an individual. So that has, I feel like there's learning from that for me, that I want to go away and I want to have a look at all the models again because I might see them in a different light. So I'm excited and intrigued to go and have a look and see, actually, would I use that with a family or an individual or a child, and kind of see what I take from that, I suppose.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose that just also concludes things in, I think, how much we learn from students as practice educators, because I've seen students using reflective tools and things that I've used with them in supervision, I've seen them then use with families, and I've realised how much that can be useful. So I think we learn a lot from one another, don't we?
Yeah, definitely.